Leipzig, East Germany, August 1977. Heidi Krieger stands in the women's shot put circle at the SC Defke Leipzig training facility, feeling the weight of the iron sphere in her palm. At 17, she's already showing promise that has caught the attention of national coaches. What she doesn't know, what she cannot know, is that the small blue pills her coaches give her each morning, the ones they tell her are vitamins necessary for elite performance, contain Oral-Turinabol, an anabolic steroid 20 times more potent than natural testosterone. She trusts her coaches completely. In the German Democratic Republic, questioning authority isn't just discouraged, it's dangerous. The pills make her stronger, yes, but they're also doing something else. Her voice is deepening. Hair grows in places it shouldn't. Her menstrual cycle becomes irregular, then stops entirely. When she mentions these changes, the team doctors dismiss her concerns with clinical efficiency. Normal side effects of intense training, they assure her. All elite athletes experience this. What Heidi Krieger doesn't realize, what would only become clear decades later when the Stasi files were unsealed, is that she's not an athlete. She's an experiment, a test subject in State Plan 1425, the most systematic, state-sponsored doping program in sporting history. The East German sports medicine establishment isn't trying to make her a better female athlete. They're chemically transforming her body to see how far they can push the boundaries of performance before the human cost becomes too visible to hide. By the time the Berlin Wall falls 12 years later, Heidi Krieger will no longer exist. In her place will be Andreas Krieger, a man born not from choice, but from forced medical experimentation that destroyed the woman she was meant to be. In the late 1960s, East German sports officials faced a brutal reality. Their nation of 17 million could never compete with the Soviet Union's massive athletic infrastructure or America's professional sports culture through conventional means. But what if science could create a shortcut? Dr. Manfred Höppner, the chief architect of East Germany's doping system, believed he had found the answer. "We are not cheating," he wrote in a 1974 classified memo to the Sports Medical Service. "We are applying cutting-edge sports medicine to maximize the genetic potential of our athletes. This is scientific progress, not fraud." The logic was seductive in its simplicity. East Germany couldn't produce more athletes, but it could produce superhuman ones. The GDR's leadership saw Olympic gold medals as proof of socialist superiority, tangible evidence that their system produced better humans than capitalism could. As Erich Honecker, General Secretary of the Socialist Unity Party, declared in 1972, "Each gold medal for the GDR is a defeat for the imperialist Federal Republic." The initial medical assessments suggested the risks were manageable. Dr. Höppner's research indicated that carefully controlled doses of Oral-Turinabol could increase muscle mass and recovery speed without producing obvious masculinizing effects, at least not immediately visible ones. The drugs were given code names, supporting means in official documents, little blue beans among athletes who didn't know what they were taking. What made the program particularly insidious was its bureaucratic precision. This wasn't rogue doctors experimenting on athletes. It was state policy, approved at the highest levels, documented in thousands of pages of meticulous records. The Stasi, East Germany's secret police, maintained files on every athlete, tracking dosages, performances, and side effects with the same cold efficiency they used to monitor political dissidents. Rolf Hempel, a swimming coach who later defected, explained the mindset. "We genuinely believed we were building a better society. The West had money and resources. We had science and discipline. If our science could make a girl swim faster than an American girl with access to the best facilities, that proved our system worked." The public narrative was carefully crafted. East German newspapers celebrated their female swimmers and track athletes as embodiments of socialist womanhood. Strong, disciplined, superior to their decadent Western counterparts. When Western media began questioning the masculine appearance of East German female athletes in the mid-1970s, GDR officials responded with righteous indignation. "This is typical capitalist sexism," declared Neues Deutschland, the official party newspaper. They cannot accept that socialist women can be both feminine and physically superior. Initial results seem to validate the strategy. At the 1976 Montreal Olympics, East German women won 11 of 13 swimming gold medals. Their shot putters and discus throwers dominated global competitions. The pharmaceutical enhancement was invisible to spectators and undetectable by existing drug tests. Huppner's projections suggested they could maintain this advantage for decades. But there were warning signs from the beginning, signs deliberately ignored or suppressed. Team doctors noted irregular menstrual cycles, voice changes, and abnormal hair growth in female athletes as early as 1972. These observations were documented in classified reports but never acted upon. When swimmer Carola Barakcian developed severe liver problems at age 16, her medical records were altered to hide the connection to steroid use. The athletes themselves were kept deliberately ignorant. Most were teenagers when the doping began, children trusting adults in positions of authority. They were told the pills were vitamins, supplements, or necessary medications. Those who questioned were threatened with expulsion from training programs, which in the GDR meant losing access to education, housing benefits, and their entire social identity. The origins of State Plan 1425 trace back to 1968, when East German sports officials realized their athletic programs were falling behind despite massive state investment. The problem was fundamental. You couldn't command athletic excellence the way you could command factory production. Dr. Manfred Huppner, appointed head of the Sports Medical Service in 1967, had studied Soviet sports medicine extensively and believed pharmaceutical intervention was the future of elite athletics. But the Soviets were cautious, using steroids selectively on adult male athletes. Huppner proposed something far more systematic: a comprehensive doping program that would target female athletes from puberty onward, when their bodies would respond most dramatically to androgenic hormones. The scientific rationale was cold-blooded in its logic. Female athletes have naturally lower testosterone levels than males, which limits muscle development and recovery capacity. Introduce synthetic testosterone, and the performance gains are dramatic, far more significant than in male athletes who already have high natural testosterone. From a purely results-driven perspective, doping women produced better returns than doping men. Huppner presented his proposal to the Central Committee of the Socialist Unity Party in May 1968. The classified document, later discovered in Stasi archives, was titled Thesis on the Development of a Comprehensive Pharmacological Support System for High-Performance Athletes in the GDR-EOR. The language was bureaucratic, clinical, devoid of ethical consideration. Athletes were referred to as performance units. Side effects were acceptable collateral outcomes. The proposal was approved with minimal debate. In a totalitarian system where the state already controlled education, employment, housing, and travel, controlling athletes' bodies seemed like a logical extension of existing authority. The drug at the center of the program was Oral-Turinabol, developed by the East German pharmaceutical company Vep-Genopharm in 1961. Chemically, it was a modified form of dianabol, designed to be taken orally and to have reduced androgenic effects compared to other steroids. In practice, reduced meant the masculine side effects developed slightly more slowly, not that they didn't occur. Implementation began in 1969 with a pilot program involving 200 female swimmers and track athletes. The results were immediate and dramatic. Girls who had been mediocre competitors suddenly began breaking national records. Swim times dropped by seconds. Shot put distances increased by meters. The improvements were so significant that Western coaches suspected doping, but the athletes themselves often didn't know they were being drugged. The program expanded rapidly. By 1972, over 1,000 female athletes were receiving systematic doses of Oral-Turinabol. By 1978, the number exceeded 4,000. The logistics were managed with typical East German efficiency. Pills distributed during training sessions, dosages recorded in coded medical files, performance improvements tracked against pharmaceutical intake. Coaches received detailed instructions from the Sports Medical Service. For teenage female swimmers, the protocol was typically 5 to 20 milligrams of Oral-Turinabol daily during training periods, reduced during competition to avoid detection. Shot putters and discus throwers received higher doses, up to 35 milligrams daily. The youngest athletes began doping as early as age 12, when their bodies were most vulnerable to hormonal manipulation. Dr. Lothar Kipke, who worked in the Sports Medical Service from 1973 to 1979, later testified, "We knew exactly what we were doing. We had studies showing the side effects: masculinization, liver damage, psychological changes. But the directive from the Central Committee was clear. Gold medals justified the costs. We were told these athletes were sacrificing for the glory of the socialist state." The Stasi's involvement was comprehensive. Department XX3, responsible for sports security, maintained detailed files on every athlete in the program. They monitored for potential defectors who might expose the system. They tracked which athletes showed troubling side effects. They even prepared cover stories and falsified medical records to be used if international sports federations began investigating. One Stasi document from 1977, declassified in 1998, laid out the security protocol explicitly. Athletes experiencing significant masculinization effects represent potential security risks. Such individuals should be monitored for emotional instability and prevented from contact with Western media. In extreme cases, removal from international competition and reassignment to domestic coaching roles is recommended. The cynicism was breathtaking. The same state that was destroying these young women's bodies was simultaneously planning how to silence them if they objected. June 1976, Montreal Olympic Trials, East Berlin. Cornelia Ender steps onto the blocks for the 100-meter freestyle. At 17, she's already broken world records in this event multiple times. Her shoulders are broader than most male swimmers her age. Her voice is so deep that Western journalists have speculated she might be biologically male. What they don't know is that Cornelia has been taking Oral-Turinabol since age 14, doses that have increased from 5 milligrams daily to 30 milligrams during peak training. She wins by nearly 2 seconds, a margin of dominance unheard of in elite swimming. Her time, 55.65 seconds, won't be beaten by a clean athlete for over 20 years. In the stands, Dr. Huppner watches with satisfaction, making notes in a leather-bound logbook that will later be entered as evidence in German criminal trials. Beside her name, he writes, "Optimal response. Continue current protocol. Subject shows excellent tolerance." Subject. Not athlete, not person. Subject. That same month, shot putter Ilona Slupianek competes at the East German National Championships. At 19, she can throw the 4-kilogram shot put 22 meters, a distance that would win most men's college competitions. Her body has changed so dramatically that her parents barely recognize her. Her face has become angular, masculine. Hair grows on her chest and back. Her clitoris has enlarged to the point where she experiences pain during routine movements. When she complains to team doctors, they increase her dosage. The Montreal Olympics in July 1976 marked the moment when East German doping became undeniable to observers, and yet remained unprovable. The GDR's women won 11 of 13 swimming gold medals. They swept the 100-meter and 200-meter freestyle. They dominated the medley relays. Their average margin of victory was larger than the difference between second and third place. American swimmer Shirley Babashoff, who won 4 silver medals behind East German competitors, made the mistake of speaking honestly. "I'm competing against men," she told reporters. "Just look at them." The media crucified her, calling her a sore loser and ungracious. East German officials filed formal complaints about sexist discrimination against socialist women. But Babashoff was right. The average East German female swimmer at Montreal had testosterone levels higher than the average American male swimmer. What the public couldn't see were the private costs mounting behind the Iron Curtain. In Leipzig, 17-year-old Heidi Krieger noticed that her menstruation had stopped completely. She mentioned it to her coach, who assured her this was normal for elite athletes, and increased her daily dose of vitamins to 30 milligrams of Oral-Turinabol. In Halle, 14-year-old Rika Reinisch began experiencing violent mood swings and suicidal thoughts. The Sports Medical Service documented these effects as psychological adjustment challenges and prescribed additional medications to manage the symptoms they had caused. The turning point wasn't a single dramatic moment, but an accumulating horror that doctors and officials chose to ignore. By 1978, medical files documented hundreds of cases of severe masculinization, liver abnormalities, and psychological disturbances. Dr. Dorit Rusler, working in the Sports Medical Service, wrote a classified memo in March 1978 that was chilling in its clinical detachment. Long-term androgenic therapy in female subjects, aged 12-18, produces predictable masculinizing effects. Permanent voice deepening in 73% of subjects, clitoral enlargement in 89%, abnormal hair growth in 64%, permanent menstrual disruption in 91%. Recommendation: reduce visible side effects through dose adjustment while maintaining performance enhancement. Athletes showing extreme masculinization should be retired from international competition to avoid detection. The recommendation wasn't to stop the program. It was to manage it more carefully. The most devastating cases emerged in sports requiring maximum strength. Shot putters and discus throwers received the highest doses because the performance gains were most dramatic. Heidi Krieger, now competing at the elite level, was taking up to 30 milligrams daily, a dose that would be considered dangerous for a grown man. In 1986, she won the European Championships in the shot put with a throw of 21.10 meters. Standing on the podium, she felt none of the joy she'd expected. Instead, she felt trapped inside a body that no longer felt like her own. Her voice was indistinguishable from a man's. Her facial features had become angular and masculine. People on the street frequently addressed her as "Sir." But the most profound damage was psychological. The testosterone flooding her system hadn't just changed her body. It had altered her brain chemistry, her emotional patterns, her fundamental sense of self. She began experiencing gender dysphoria, feeling increasingly that she was male, not understanding that these feelings were chemically induced rather than authentic identity. "They didn't just destroy my body," Andreas Krieger would later testify. "They destroyed who I was. They made me into someone I was never meant to be. And then that person couldn't live with what had been done to her." By the late 1980s, the East German sports medicine establishment knew they were causing irreversible harm. Classified reports documented liver cancer in former athletes in their 20s, multiple suicides among retired female competitors. Dozens of cases where athletes had transitioned to living as men because their bodies had been so thoroughly masculinized. The response from officials was to tighten security, not end the program. A 1987 Stasi directive ordered enhanced surveillance of former athletes, showing psychological instability related to post-career health complications. The state wasn't worried about the damage. It was worried about exposure. The refinement of inhumanity, 1977 to 1984. Rather than scaling back the doping program in response to mounting evidence of harm, East German sports medicine became more sophisticated in hiding the damage. Dr. Heppner's Sports Medical Service developed new protocols designed to manage side effects while maintaining performance gains. They began cycling steroids, periods of high doses followed by brief washout periods to allow the body partial recovery. They introduced additional drugs to mask masculinization, birth control pills to restore menstrual cycles, though the ovarian damage was often already permanent, hair removal treatments, even primitive voice coaching to help athletes maintain feminine speech patterns despite permanent vocal cord thickening. The pharmaceutical regimen became increasingly complex. By 1982, elite female athletes weren't just taking Oral-Turinabol. They were on cocktails of anabolic steroids, testosterone, growth hormone, diuretics to mask drug tests, and various medications to manage side effects. Some athletes were taking 15 different pills daily. The medical files from this period, later seized and analyzed, reveal a chilling evolution in thinking. A 1980 internal memo from Dr. Bernd Pansold, director of the Sports Medicine Research Institute in Kreischa, recommended systematic doping should begin at age 11 to 12, when subjects are most physiologically responsive and psychologically compliant. Parental consent is unnecessary, given state authority over youth development. They weren't just doping athletes, they were doping children. The training facilities themselves evolved into pharmaceutical laboratories disguised as sports centers. The Sports Medical Service established dedicated doping rooms where pills were distributed under medical supervision. Athletes were required to take their vitamins in front of doctors to ensure compliance. Those who refused or questioned were threatened with expulsion from training programs, which meant losing their state housing, education stipends, and elite athlete privileges. Swimmer Karola Nitschke, who competed from 1978 to 1985, later described the ritual. Every morning after breakfast, we'd line up in the medical room. The doctors had trays with our names on them, each with our daily pills. You took them while they watched. If you hesitated or asked what they were, you'd be taken aside for a discussion with your coach and a Stasi officer. After that, you took the pills. Western Suspicion and Diplomatic Maneuvering, 1976-1988. Western sports federations and national Olympic committees weren't blind to what was happening. The physical transformation of East German female athletes was obvious to anyone watching. But proving systematic doping was nearly impossible. The International Olympic Committee's drug testing in the 1970s and early 1980s was laughably inadequate. Tests could detect simple testosterone injections, but not the sophisticated oral steroids East Germany used. The GDR's pharmaceutical industry had specifically designed Oral-Turinabol to clear the system faster than existing detection methods could track. Moreover, East Germany's diplomatic position provided protection. The GDR leveraged Cold War politics brilliantly. When Western officials raised doping concerns, East German representatives would frame it as capitalist propaganda against socialist achievement. They'd threaten boycotts and diplomatic incidents. In an era when the IOC was desperately trying to prevent the Olympics from becoming another Cold War battleground, they often backed down. The United States Olympic Committee faced a particularly difficult position. American swimmers and track athletes were losing to competitors they knew were doping, but without proof, accusations seemed like sour grapes. The USOC's own testing programs were primitive. They couldn't even detect the drugs East Germany was using. Dr. Robert Voy, Chief Medical Officer for the USOC from 1984 to 1989, later wrote, "We knew what was happening. We had swimmers coming back from international competitions describing the physical appearance of their East German competitors. Women with Adam's apples, voices deeper than most men, muscle mass that was physiologically impossible without pharmaceutical intervention. But we couldn't prove it, and every time we raised concerns, we were accused of sexism and poor sportsmanship." The 1988 Seoul Olympics represented the peak and the beginning of the end. East German women won a staggering share of medals, but the visual evidence had become too obvious to ignore. Photographs of shot putter Heidi Krieger showing arms more muscular than most male athletes appeared in Western newspapers. The whispers became shouts. Behind the scenes, pressure was mounting from an unexpected source: the emerging reforms in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's glasnost was making the old Soviet-style secrecy harder to maintain. Soviet sports officials, dealing with their own doping scandals, began distancing themselves from East Germany's more extreme programs. The internal costs, 1985-1989. While East Germany's sports medicine establishment was adapting to avoid international detection, the human costs were becoming impossible to hide domestically. By the mid-1980s, dozens of former athletes were experiencing severe health problems. Liver cancer rates among retired female athletes were statistically impossible to explain without pharmaceutical causes. Multiple athletes had undergone hysterectomies in their 20s due to ovarian tumors. Depression and suicide rates among former elite female athletes were dramatically higher than the general population. The Stasi maintained detailed files on these cases, not to help the victims, but to prevent them from speaking out. Department XX3 had specific protocols for managing former athletes experiencing post-career health complications related to training intensity. In practice, this meant surveillance, intimidation, and, in some cases, involuntary psychiatric treatment. One case file, documenting former swimmer Petra Schneider, revealed the system's brutality. After retiring in 1984, Schneider developed severe liver problems and depression. When she attempted to connect her health issues to the pills she'd been given during her athletic career, she was visited by Stasi officers who reminded her of the state benefits she received: her apartment, her job at a sports school, her pension. If she continued making unfounded allegations, these benefits might be reevaluated. The file noted, subject was successfully discouraged from further investigation. But not all athletes could be silenced. By 1987, whispers were circulating among retired athletes. Small networks of women who'd competed together began comparing notes on their health problems. They realized the patterns weren't coincidental. The same symptoms, the same timing, the same mysterious pills they'd all been given. The GDR's solution was characteristically totalitarian: enhanced surveillance of former athletes, particularly those showing signs of organizing or sharing information. The Stasi expanded its monitoring of sports medicine facilities, screening mail and tapping phones of anyone connected to the program. A classified 1988 Stasi assessment concluded, the long-term health consequences of pharmacological performance enhancement present a manageable security risk provided subjects remain isolated and individual complaints do not evolve into organized testimony. Recommend continued monitoring and intervention where necessary. Managed. Security risk. Intervention. The language reduced human suffering to bureaucratic problems requiring administrative solutions. November 9, 1989, Berlin. The fall of the Berlin Wall didn't just end the Cold War in Germany. It tore open the filing cabinets and laboratories that held the evidence of State Plan 1425. As East Germans poured through the newly opened border crossings, other groups moved with different purposes. Journalists, investigators, and former athletes stormed Stasi headquarters and sports medical service facilities, seizing documents before they could be destroyed. Though many files were shredded in the chaotic final days of the GDR, enough survived to reconstruct the full horror of the doping program. The numbers were staggering. Between 1968 and 1989, approximately 10,000 athletes, most of them women and girls, had been systematically doped by their own government. Roughly 2,000 experienced severe, life-altering health consequences. Conservative estimates suggested at least 400 former athletes had died prematurely from conditions directly linked to steroid use: liver cancer, heart failure, suicide. Heidi Krieger was among the first to come forward publicly. In 1997, she made a decision that stunned Germany. She transitioned to living as a man, taking the name Andreas Krieger. But unlike others who transition out of authentic gender identity, Andreas made clear that his transformation wasn't a choice. It was the completion of what East German sports medicine had started. "They took away the woman I was meant to be," Andreas testified at the 2000 trial of former East German sports officials. "The hormones they gave me from age 16 didn't just build muscle. They changed my brain, my emotions, my entire sense of self. I don't know who Heidi Krieger would have been without those drugs. That person was killed before she could exist." The trials that followed were unprecedented in sports history. In 1998, German prosecutors charged Dr. Manfred Höppner and former East German Swimming Federation director Manfred Ewald with accessory to intentional bodily harm. The evidence was overwhelming. The medical files documented everything. Dr. Höppner showed no remorse. In court, he defended the program. "We gave these athletes opportunities they never would have had. They won Olympic gold medals. They were celebrated as heroes. Yes, there were side effects, but they were informed of the risks. This was a lie, documented as such in the state's own files. Athletes had not been informed. They had been deliberately deceived." The court convicted both men in July 2000. The sentences were shockingly light. Höppner received 18 months probation, Ewald 14 months. The judge explained that given their advanced age, both were over 70, and the difficulty of attributing specific health problems to specific doses of drugs given years earlier, harsher sentences weren't justified. For the victims, the verdicts were a cruel joke. Carola Barakcian, whose liver cancer required a transplant at age 32, watched from the courtroom. "They destroyed hundreds of lives and got probation. They'll die comfortable in their beds. I'll be on immunosuppressants for the rest of my life." The international sports establishment faced its own reckoning. The International Olympic Committee commissioned an investigation in 2001 that confirmed what everyone had known: systematic state-sponsored doping on a scale never seen before or since. But the IOC faced a dilemma. Stripping medals from East German athletes would punish the victims, not the perpetrators. Most of the athletes hadn't known they were doping. The solution was bureaucratic. The IOC noted the findings but took no action. East German records stood. The medals remained awarded. The message was clear. Sports authorities valued the integrity of their record books more than justice for the athletes. Perhaps the most devastating impact was personal. Dozens of former athletes came forward describing lives destroyed by drugs they didn't know they were taking. Many couldn't have children due to permanent ovarian damage. Others had transitioned to living as men because their bodies had been so thoroughly masculinized that returning to female identity was psychologically impossible. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Studies of East German female athletes who competed between 1968 and 1989 found rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD far higher than the general population. Suicide rates were 3 times higher than demographically similar women who hadn't been elite athletes. They didn't just cheat in sports, former swimmer Rika Reinisch said in a 2005 interview. They experimented on children to win medals. They destroyed our bodies and our minds for propaganda purposes. And when it was exposed, most of them faced no real consequences. The program's ultimate impact extended beyond the individual victims. It poisoned an entire generation's relationship with competitive sports. It demonstrated how totalitarian states could weaponize medicine itself. And it revealed the moral bankruptcy of treating human beings as instruments of state policy. By 2000, comprehensive medical studies had documented the damage. 94% of female athletes doped before age 16 experienced permanent voice deepening. 67% suffered irreversible menstrual disruption. 58% developed significant facial and body hair growth that persisted decades after steroid use ended. 45% experienced severe depression or anxiety disorders directly linked to hormonal manipulation. The East German sports doping program represented the ultimate instrumentalization of human beings, children transformed into pharmaceutical test subjects in pursuit of national prestige. It was systematic, documented, deliberate, and when exposed, the perpetrators faced minimal consequences, while the victims lived with permanent damage. Andreas Krieger still lives in Germany, working as a sports coach and advocate for doping victims. He married former shot putter Ute Kraus, herself a victim of the same program. Together, they've become voices for the thousands of athletes whose bodies and lives were sacrificed to state Plan 14.25. People ask me if I'm angry, Andreas said in a 2018 interview marking the 29th anniversary of the Berlin Wall's fall. Angry doesn't begin to describe it. They stole my body. They stole who I could have been. They made me into this person, and I have to live with it every day. Heidi Krieger died at 16, killed by blue pills disguised as vitamins. The legacy of East German doping extends far beyond the individuals directly harmed. It fundamentally changed how we understand sports medicine, ethics, and the relationship between states and athletes. It demonstrated that pharmaceutical enhancement wasn't just cheating. It could be weaponized by governments as a form of systematic abuse. Modern anti-doping protocols exist largely because of what East Germany did. The World Anti-Doping Agency, established in 1999, was a direct response to the revelations from Stasi files. The biological passport system, which tracks athletes' blood values over time to detect doping without catching specific drugs, was developed specifically to prevent state-sponsored programs like the GDRs from recurring. Yet the echoes continue. Russia's systematic doping program, exposed in 2014, followed remarkably similar patterns. State coordination, pharmaceutical sophistication, security service involvement, deliberate deception of young athletes. The methods were updated, but the fundamental logic, using athletes as instruments of national prestige regardless of the human cost, remained unchanged. The medical community has also grappled with the ethical implications. The doctors who designed and implemented State Plan 14.25 had medical degrees from respected institutions. They published research in scientific journals. They justified their actions with the language of science and progress. The program revealed how easily medical ethics could be subordinated to state ideology when doctors became agents of government policy rather than advocates for patient well-being. For the broader Cold War narrative, the East German doping program represents something particularly dark. The willingness to sacrifice children for symbolic victories in ideological competition. The GDR couldn't match West Germany economically or politically, but it could manufacture Olympic champions through pharmaceutical intervention. That this required destroying young people's bodies was simply an acceptable cost of Cold War competition. The question that haunts Andreas Krieger and hundreds of other survivors is whether justice was ever really served. The doctors received probation. The coaches were never prosecuted. The state officials who approved the program faced no consequences. Meanwhile, the victims live with permanent physical damage, psychological trauma, and the knowledge that their suffering was documented, deliberate, and ultimately deemed acceptable by those in power. Standing in that shot-put circle in Leipzig in 1977, Heidi Krieger trusted her coaches when they handed her those blue pills. She believed in the system, believed in her country, believed the adults responsible for her welfare would protect her. That trust was betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. Her body was treated as a state property, to be chemically modified in pursuit of medals that officials could display as proof of socialist superiority. The East German sports doping program didn't just create women who became men. It revealed what happens when human beings become instruments of ideology, when medical science serves state propaganda rather than individual well-being. Those blue pills weren't vitamins. They were violence, administered daily, with clinical precision, to children who had no idea what was being done to them. Thousands of women paid the price. The world took notice only after the system that destroyed them had already collapsed.